This morning, I was looking out my window and I could see a branch moving. There was only one branch moving in the tree, and so I assumed that there was something which was causing that branch to move. It wasn't the wind because all of the branches would be moving, so I figured it was a cat or a squirrel up in the tree. I sat there for another second or two and watched the branch, and then I could see a furry little tail. It was obviously from a squirrel, but I still at that point actually couldn't see the squirrel. I, by indirectly observing the evidence of the tree moving and the tail's existence, I was able to surmise, obviously, that a squirrel was the culprit of the moving branch. Now, this probably doesn't seem all that significant for everyday life, but I noticed that this was a metaphor for how spirituality or God or whatever you want to call it uh, also has its proof of existence indirectly in our reality. And so, what I mean by that is that we cannot observe whatever, I hate to use the word God because it has so many different connotations, but whatever all that is, or source, or cosmic mind that is the underlying cause of all of reality doesn't exactly just show up. That would be nice. I think we'd all appreciate if God or whatever just stepped down and gave a little wave and said, "Hey, everybody, here I am." But it's not quite that simple. I think for a variety of reasons, including that God isn't some bearded man sitting up in the sky judging us, watching all of our actions, and then determining whether or not we go to heaven or hell. That sounds a lot more like Santa Claus to me than God. I would consider whatever it is to be more impersonal and not kind of like a human sitting up there. I think we've personified God to a large extent based on the fact that we're human. And so that's about as good as an understanding as we can come to. We figure, okay, well, since I behave like this and everybody else around me behaves like this, then this thing that started reality must also. But I think that's a very limited view. Um, we try to use words and understanding based on our experience to define whatever this thing is. But ultimately, that's all going to fall short, in my opinion. God is ineffable, meaning that we can't say anything about it. The best that we can do, in my opinion, is say something that it's not. The more we try to define it, the more we're really revealing our own judgments and biases for what we figure this thing is. But back to the squirrel and how its indirect evidence was proof that this squirrel existed, even though I hadn't seen the squirrel yet. I saw the branch shaken, then I saw a tail move, and so at that point, I could fairly well determine that a squirrel was up there. Okay, the squirrel exists. I saw this proof. What does that have to do with God and the indirect proof of its existence in our reality? Well, one of the ways I think that God shows up in our world is synchronicities. Now, this is a term that was originally coined by Carl Jung, the psychologist. And one of the things that he had said about synchronicity was that synchronicity is a meaningful coincidence of two or more events where something other than the probability of chance is involved. Now, if you go back to this squirrel example, I think that this fits that same definition because there were two or more events, and it was obvious that chance wasn't involved, that a tree branch started shaking on its own. The whole tree wasn't shaking, so I could rule out the wind. And then I had the tail come in, which, doesn't just fall from the sky usually, although who knows. And so it was more than chance. It was a meaningful coincidence. Even the term coincidence actually originally derives from a geometric term where it meant to coincide, and it had to do with the angles of shapes. And so if you think of a triangle, for example, if you know two of the angles of any triangle by the whole Pythagorean theorem, which I don't think I quite remember because that was quite a while ago that I took geometry back in high school. A squared plus b squared equals c squared. All right, maybe I do. Anyway, that's not the point. The point is, if you know two of the angles, you can surmise what the third angle will be in a triangle by using this Pythagorean theorem that apparently I still remember to this day. But if you consider the fact that a coincidence isn't just like this happenstance, run of the mill thing that the definition had at this point has actually kind of come to take, where it's not really meaningful. It's just, oh, that was just a coincidence, as opposed to, well, actually, this thing that happened was more than just chance. There's actually a theorem that you could come up with and realize that, oh, okay, like actually, the fact that this branch was shaking, the fact that you saw a furry little tail in a tree, that means that there was a squirrel. Now, I think that we can do the same thing with God to some degree. Obviously, it's a lot more complicated than a squirrel shaking a branch, but how many times in your life have you had something happen that just couldn't be explained? I know that this happens to me uh, somewhat regularly. If I'm lucky, maybe once or twice a day. But usually, when this happens, it's pretty obvious that there's no way that this could have just happened by chance. Usually, also, when this happens to me, it's really only meaningful for my own life. I wish that there was some way that I could explain these synchronicities that show up in my life to someone else, but they're really only meaningful because they happen to me. I've tried to explain them 1,000 times to other people and get all excited and try to tell them, oh, but you don't understand. Like, there's no way that this could have just like happened to me. But I think one of the aspects of synchronicities is that they're meant for you and you alone. They really only have meaning because it's happening in your life. When you try to explain it, it just doesn't quite have the same weight that it did to someone else as it did in your own life. But I think that these synchronicities or coincidences are kind of God's way, or whatever you want to call this thing. Not even a thing, I would say, but its way of sort of revealing its existence, so to speak. There's a quote from Einstein also, now that I'm talking about this, which hopefully I can remember correctly, but he said that coincidence is God's way of remaining anonymous. And I think that this is completely true because these things are just hinted at, and ultimately you as the individual have to come to the conclusions yourself. And so, in the same way that if we're told something, it isn't as meaningful if we just hear it second or third hand, as opposed to experiencing it for ourselves. I think that ultimately we have to come up with our own conclusion of what God is and whether or not it exists. And we can use these little everyday synchronicities, coincidences, whatever you want to call them, as proof um, of its existence. But again, we have to be the ones to put it together. And so, reading some sacred text or whatever it might be is not going to give us the same experience as going through these things in our own lives. But the key is just staying open, realizing that they exist. And I think ultimately we can all come to our own conclusions and see the existence of these things for ourselves.